or at least through most of the 1930s and 40s when it got off the ground. And so that is really what we have to see is this isn't a human that we're up against, any individual human. It's individual human beings, democratically elected representatives of the actual democratic will of the people up against a machine, a monster that we've created that actually has to be shut down in order for us to actually have any chance of winning. And I can go into great detail on that.
So it's not an individual. Is it an entity of individuals that are all conspiring together, or is it totally decompartmentalized?
It's totally decompartmentalized. I think that's actually what makes it so hard to capture. Sort of like there's an analogy, and we'll come back to the deep state piece of this, but it's deeply related to, say, censorship in this country. The way censorship is increasingly being carried out is initially the first version, the version that our founding fathers would have cared about, would have been the government carrying out censorship directly, saying that you, Sean, can't speak to criticize me as a member of the government. What they started to do is they started to be a waterfall. It wasn't the president directly saying it, but it was administrative agencies. So it's the bureaucrats saying that you're creating misinformation that endangers the public. So I, as the president, am not going to be an autocratic king, but it's just going to be the technocrats saying that, hey, here's some things you can't say. Then it goes one step further down the waterfall, because that's still the government, to say, okay, well, we the technocrats can't do it, but we'll have a meeting with you if you're a social media company. And we'll tell you that, hey, you know, the guy who used to work for me now worked in the private sector. That's the place I'm going to work later on as well. So we already have a friendly peer-like relationship. Not that we think we're doing something corrupt, but it's just the same kind of people who we understand each other. We have the common good in mind. And come on, you know the truth, that people need to take vaccines, that people can't be trusted with a Hunter Biden laptop story. It's probably Russian disinformation on the eve of an election. Come on, you know what I'm talking about here. People need to take the vaccines. We've got to build public trust. I need you to make sure that you're looking after which users are criticizing our government policy. So say I'm Andy Slavitt in the White House, and say you're a counterpart at Twitter, and we're having a conversation saying, and I'm not making this stuff up, this is just literally what happened. Why is, what was this guy's name? It's an individual critic of the government, Alex Berenson, right? They literally name him by name. Hey, Alex Berenson, that guy, he's criticizing government policies on vaccination. That's eroding public trust. He's part of the disinformation dozen. Why haven't you shut it down yet? And you come back and say, well, you know, we think we have a free speech platform. No, you don't get it. Come on, you understand this. We're in this for the country. Why haven't you shut down his account yet? So then that horizontal managerial class goes and shuts down its account of that person because they know that the government side of it is still their regulator. So now we've gone from the president to then delegate it to say, okay, the president's not doing censorship, it's just the administrative state. Now it's not just the administrative state, but it's the private sector. It's becoming more and more decentralized. And then what does Twitter do? Or what does Google do? They don't even have human beings doing it. They train AI to do it, right? And so they kick it out to AI algorithms, which are themselves automatically, without human judgments, squashing certain kinds of information that they've been trained to view as dangerous, false, or misinformation. A dirty little secret is that many of those algorithms have been so trained that the AI itself now spots American flags that are on someone's profile. So if you're somebody who has an American flag in your social media profile, the algorithms are already trained to pay greater scrutiny to what you say.
Are you serious?
I'm not joking about this. And it's not a human being that made that judgment. It's the AI that itself has been trained to say that these are the kinds of people who need to actually be silenced and suppressed. It's a dirty little secret in Silicon Valley. And actually, it's many of the same third-party firms. So it's just the cascade. You go from the president to the administrative state to executives at Twitter or YouTube or whatever. Executives to then third parties, but the same third-party firms that are working for the big tech guys, and the third-party firms themselves writing algorithms and AI to be able to decentralize it. So why do I bring that example up as it relates back to our example of talking about the FBI? It's a machine that we're up against. If we think it's individual person-to-person combat, we found the bad guys, we walked into the globalist cabal, and here we got them with smoking cigars in the back room, deciding this is exactly how the rest of society lives at large. That's the wrong mental model. That's how it worked in the old world. That's true. Because what we have today going on in the United States of America is a modern 1775 moment. Right? That's where I think we are in the country. And in the old world, the way it worked is there were a group of people who got together in the back of palace halls and determined what was right for the rest of society at large. Because the old world vision, and it's absolutely a vision that's rearing its head again in this country today, is that we the people cannot be trusted to sort out our differences through free speech and open debate in a constitutional republic on how we fight climate change or racial injustice. Sean, Vivek, we the people as individuals cannot be trusted. It has to be decided in the back of palace halls by the enlightened elite. And we fought a revolution to say hell no to that vision. That yes, we the people in this constitutional republic decide how we self-govern, thank you very much. Well, now that old monster is rearing its head again, except this time they say, well, it's maybe in the back of palace halls like a 3-letter government building in Washington, D.C. But you show up there and it isn't quite there. There's no smoking gun. There's no smoking cigars. So then you say maybe it's the corner office of BlackRock and their avenue of their C-suite on Park Avenue. Well, it's not quite there either. It's woven into a machine of a horizontal managerial class comprised of people in 3-letter agencies in government, comprised of the people who professionally sit on corporate boards, the associate deans of God knows what at universities, the ambassadors to some second-tier nation in Europe that was a donor to a political party. It's the same managerial class that makes it very hard to identify because it pervades multiple institutions both within and outside of government. That's what we're up against. And I think that's the moment we live in today. Do we trust we the people to sort out our differences through free speech and open debate? And I think that elevates what this election, including this GOP primary, is all about. Do you stand on the side of incremental reform within those existing institutions, in which case you should probably go with somebody else? Or do you stand for revolution? And I stand on the side of revolution, the American Revolution, the ideals of 1776 that we need to revive. That's the moment we live in this country. And I think it's going to take deeper than just scratching the surface of even Republicans or Democrats, or even pointing to individuals, Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, they're too old. Yeah, all that's true. But there's something deeper going on. And I think that's what we have to open our eyes to. That's what pulled me into this. Because I don't think anybody else really sees it this way.
That's the best description of the deep state I've ever heard. So how are we going to break that up? I mean, that sounds extremely complicated.
It is, well, here's what I'll say. It is hard in that it won't be easy. But it is simple in that it's not complicated, okay? And I think we got to keep that distinction clear in our minds. We have 3 branches of government. It's actually pretty simple. It's enshrined in a readable document cover to cover. I do it from time to time. The U.S. Constitution. Something that we've forgotten, maybe needs to be taught in high school. I personally think every high school student should have to pass the same civics test that an immigrant has to pass in order to become a citizen of this country. Young people don't know anything about what that flag represents. Many of them, that's when you don't know what it represents, it's why you bend the knee to a trans flag instead of the flag of the United States of America.
Yeah.
They're teachers, there's actually a sad story of a teacher recently who removed the flag of the Pledge of Allegiance and put the trans flag up instead as the kids in the classroom pledged allegiance to it. But that's because when the symbols themselves lose their meaning, we got to restore the meaning for the symbols to actually mean something back. And so, anyway, I go back to what do we have? It's not abstract theories. It's enshrined in our Declaration of Independence, which is the best mission statement for a nation known to mankind. It is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, which is the best operating manual for a nation known to mankind, certainly a free nation. And so I don't think that this is complicated. I think it is hard. There's the distinction that I would draw. It's hard in that it's not easy, so I'm not blithe about the challenge, but I have a pretty clear conception of how this works. There's one executive branch of government. Article 2 of the Constitution does not create 2 executive branches, a president and then a separate administrative state. There's one executive branch of government. It's called the unitary theory of the executive. I come at this as an outsider. I think that's definitely what it's going to take. An insider who grew up in professional politics and even learned to say the things that I'm saying now or in woke ink as a second tongue. That's good if you're governor or a lawmaker or a state legislator or a senator. When you're talking about the next president, you need an outsider who has a first personal native understanding of how to get this done. But it's got to be an outsider who also deeply understands the Constitution. Somebody who understands that If someone works for you and you cannot fire them, that means they don't work for you. It means you work for them because you're responsible for what they do without having any authority to actually change it. I refuse to be a hollowed out husk as a CEO of a company. I refuse to be a hollowed out husk as the chief executive of the executive branch of the government. Read Article 2 of the Constitution. That's not how it works. Now, you also need a president who has an understanding of the laws passed under that Constitution. So we have some time. I'll get deep with you here. We're tackling the deep state. Let's get deep on how we dismantle it.
Let's do it.
Very poorly understood laws by former presidents. Even Trump, I think this is where he fell short, is that the advisors who came from that same managerial class, I mean, be it in the national security establishment, I love Trump's instincts. Too bad you got John Bolton in charge as your chief and most important foreign policy person, as your national security advisor. He's an old school neocon, so Trump has his hands hamstrung a little bit if the guy you're working through actually has a completely different vision. Same thing for the administrative state. He wanted to dismantle the deep state, but they told him things like, oh, you can't do it because there are civil service protections. Well, here's my suggestion. Read the law, okay? And I have. The civil service protections only apply to individual firings because the thing they're supposed to protect against, and we could debate whether we like this or not, but this is the law, that we don't want a president who's elected by the public to politicize the firing of any particular expert. Say, let's say you're, some underling in the State Department and you said something I don't like about, abortion, but you're a competent person and I'm the president. I say, well, fire him. That's what the laws are designed to protect against.
Okay.
We could debate whether that's a good thing or not, but that's just how the civil service rules work. On their own terms, those laws do not apply to mass layoffs. Say I instead come in and want to say that I want to lay off 75% of the people or shut down this agency. The civil service protections don't apply to that on the terms of their own law. So you have Trump, the people around him basically did not want him to do the things he wanted to do. So they tell him, oh, no, the civil service protections stop you from those firings. How about actually go into the root original purpose and then read the law and actually say, all right, well, how about just a mass firing? And mass layoffs are absolutely what I am bringing to the Washington, D.C. federal bureaucracy. Take some other laws, the 1977 Presidential Reorganization Act. This is a law that basically says that there's limited circumstances. What do they tell Trump? If you want to shut down an agency, you have to ask Congress. Generally, that's true, but there are laws on the books that say under certain limited circumstances, if it's going to stimulate the economy or if it eliminates redundant agencies, then you absolutely, as the president, already have the authority as the chief executive. Just like a board of directors gives it to a CEO, Congress has already given the CEO the authority, in this case, the U.S. president, to shut down those divisions.
What agencies in particular would you shut down other than the FBI?
Department of Education, CDC, IRS, ATF, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I've talked about the FBI extensively, and that's just the start. I think that we're going to continue to go down that list.
Would you replace them with other agencies?
In certain cases, yes. In certain cases, no. So if you want to talk about the FBI, maybe we can, since
let's talk about the FBI.
Some sort of shared interest there, and it's topical right now when we're having this conversation. So in the FBI's case, I would shut it down. I wouldn't build something else to take its place, but I would make good judgments on how we still carry out the functions that we need to have carried out without a corrupt bureaucracy in the middle. So at the local level, let's just start there. You have local police and local prosecutors. Mm-hmm. You don't have a separate investigative bureaucracy sitting in between. Well, at the federal level, you've got U.S. prosecutors and you've got the U.S. Marshals. We have this separate bureaucracy built in the legacy of J. Edgar Hoover sitting in between. That's part of the problem. Excuse me. So I want to go deep on this. There's 35,000 some odd employees at the FBI. 15,000 of them are doing good, honest work. They're generally the investigators on the front line, the agents on the front line. Well, we need them, but actually one of the things that's happened in the FBI is they've lost all specialization, right? So this is part of a cultural shift. That's what happens in a bureaucracy, even in a company. Same thing happens in the federal government, is they all just end up being a bunch of generalists, but they're worse than at busting up child sex trafficking rings, or worse at investigating drug crimes. See the influx of fentanyl by mules and coyotes coming through the tunnels, cartel finance tunnels underneath our southern border. Even financial crimes don't have the sophistication to go after true white-collar theft today. And so you have a bunch of generalists who are ineffective at their jobs because the FBI is this generalist institution. When what I would say is those 15,000, after we shut down the FBI, still have a job in the federal government. We're just going to move them to either the U.S. Marshals or the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, or the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, where they will, by the way, have greater specialization at agencies. Those three agencies have not been politically corrupted in the same way the FBI has and carry out their work. That's 15,000 of the 35,000. The other 20,000, they're really the true bureaucrats. And that's the source of the politicization. That's the source of the rot. It's almost not even their fault because if you have, it's just a law of human nature. This happens at the U.S. Federal Reserve too, which I can talk about in a second. When you have a bunch of people who are showing up to work who should have never had that job in the first place, the biggest problem isn't just their headcount costs. That's a problem too. But it's the fact that when they're supposed to show up to, when they show up to work when they're not supposed to, they find things to do, right? That's actually more damaging. So those 20,000 people are going to be sent home and they have to find honest work in the private sector. Truth is, we have more private sector jobs today than we do have people in this country. So this could be good for our economy, good for lifeblood. It might even be good for them to get back into the real world, understand what honest work looks like.
Yeah.
But when I say shut down the FBI, and since I've been saying this, I'm grateful that other candidates have now taken this on, and that's great, but we live in a moment where it takes a president who isn't a parrot for somebody else's slogans, be it another candidate or be it a political consultant class or a mega donor. We live in complicated times, and I think it requires an outsider, but a president who has a first personal understanding of how to get the job done. And that's what called me into this. I didn't think I was going to be running for president right now. A year ago, if you told me this is what I'd be doing right now, I'd say you were nuts, and that sounds like a sharp poke in the eye. But the reality is, I don't think we have 20 years to work with as a country. I don't think we're done yet. I think we still have an opportunity to say we are on our way up. Okay, maybe we have some bumps along the way, but that we're still just a little young, going through our own version of adolescence, our teenage years, figuring out who we're going to be. That's the optimistic way I'd like to see it, and I think it can be so. But if we wait another 20 years, I think that's the ball game, and I think right now we live in a moment where it's going to take a unique combination of traits to see this through and get that job done, and a standard professional politician is just not going to be able to do it. They're wired in the way they are for a reason. It's going to take someone coming in from the outside.
How are you going to find the right people to surround yourself with when you get in there? I mean,
Yeah.
we know Trump had a hell of a time with that.
Yeah, so look, I mean, first of all, I want to say I think Trump was an excellent president. I think that the fact that there's a bunch of people that would rather see me bashing the guy who I think was probably the best president of the 21st century, definitely the best president of the 21st century, and whose election over Hillary Clinton in 2016 was probably the single most important political event of my lifetime. No, I'm not going to sit here and bash him. I respect him and his legacy, and I think we got to carry that forward. But I will also learn from the areas where he fell short. That's what I'll say, is maybe if I was in his position back in 2016, I would have done the same thing. But this isn't about me or him. It's about the country, right? And so building on that foundation, one of the things we have to learn is that it's not a one-man job in the end. You're going to need people who you trust around you. And some of this is just a question of time, right? We're worried about winning an election. You're just not going to have the time to get started on the job in the first years where most of the work actually gets done. And I think this is where one of the big disappointments and the momentum stoppers of Trump, the top one was the fact that his presidency was beset by a false basis impeachment witch hunt that they went on a made-up Russia collusion hoax. But the second thing that was a little bit of an own goal was the air we took out of the balloon when President Trump failed to secure the number one legislative victory he promised on the campaign trail, which was to repeal and replace Obamacare because Congress refused to do it, a Republican-controlled Congress and Senate. And so that took a little bit of the wind out of the sails. And I think he just didn't have the right people around him driving that through. I think it was a failure of execution of the people who reported into him. So that's a long way of saying we're already starting.
You're already identifying people.
Absolutely. So I spent the first 3 months, there's a big team that worked on this for us, identifying, first of all, the federal judges. Because those, when we get into office, We can't waste time on that. We got to get those judicial appointments right all the way through, especially coming off the heels of a Biden administration that rolled back some of the good that happened, much of the good that happened on the appeals courts and the district courts under Trump. So we're already ready to go with that. I've published my list of appellate court nominees, of prospective Supreme Court nominees, and so we're already rolling. That train has already left the station. That's out there. Now we're moving to other positions in the federal government. And one of the temptations, Sean, is to focus on the cabinet level positions, because that's what will get headlines during a campaign. And let's be honest, we have a campaign yet to win, right? But if we're really also focusing on the actual substance, the more important positions are positions like the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, the HR department of the executive branch, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. It's like the CFO of the executive branch, the CFO of the government. These are positions that don't grab headlines. But if you're talking about ultimately dismantling the administrative state, and that's what I'm going in to do, the plumbing is what matters. And the people in those positions, Sean, in those positions too, for me, are going to have to be bulldogs that are unidirectionally implementing my vision for reducing the federal employee headcount by over 75%, rescinding most federal regulations, which I believe are unconstitutional because they didn't go through Congress. And I think this is also one of the areas where I can learn from the Trump experience, where he put people in those roles who ended up being ambassadors for the deep state back to the president and explaining all the reasons why you couldn't do things. In the OPM and OMB roles, no. I want bulldogs, people who are my ambassador to the administrative state and will see this through and stop at nothing and break walls and break glass until they get the thing done. And so a lot of those people, I think, will be in those kind of positions, will be fiercely anti-government, even libertarian-oriented in their orientation, not really coming from the traditional Republican Party ranks. And then when it comes to the cabinet positions, sure, we're going to need people in, the Secretary of State who is a realist when it comes to foreign policy rather than a neocon, and people whose policy objectives align with mine. But where I'm focused first is on the plumbing positions. The other thing we're doing right now, actually, this is the first time I'm sharing this in public, but might as well. I mean, I think the public deserves to know, is we have a sort of a closet exercise in our own campaign where we are setting up a plan to cut 75% of those federal employees. I want 50% of them cut by the end of year one. That is a monumental undertaking to get this right. And so we're not going to be able to interview each of those people, let alone make the good judgments about who's on which side. So I'm working with a team of people from the business world, from the investment world, from the venture capital world, from the world of psychology, from the world of organizational behavior, and also with experience in government, to put together large-scale screening tests on multiple attributes, not just competence, but even more importantly, psychological attributes, work ethic attributes, perspectives on the Constitution, restraint of someone who believes whether or not they should be more restrained or whether or not they should be more expansive in the roles that they carry out in the federal government. By about February of next year, I think we will be in a position to put out our screening filter. And then by March 1 next year, we're already going to have that team in motion, ready to hit the ground running when I take over by the following January 20th, 2025. That's not the start line. We have a running start to that start line. And I think that that's what it's going to take to be able to see this through and get that job done.
Well, that was actually my next question, is if you have an estimation on how long it would take to complete this. Sounds like the majority of it would be done in year one.
Yes. And I think the reality is, history teaches this to us. By year two, you're bogged down in your legislative priorities. And so this is one of the things that I'm doing a little bit differently than pretty much every president in modern history. Maybe Reagan you could actually point to as the last president who got this right. Presidents make this mistake all the time, and it's an understandable one. And the way they campaign, you know if they're going to make that mistake based on you seeing how they campaign. Do they campaign on legislative promises? Democrat, Republican, this isn't a partisan thing. Say, here are the laws I will pass. Here's the only little kerfuffle in that. You're working with a 500-plus person body on Capitol Hill to see that through. that is designed to be cumbersome, that is designed to be slow. And I'm not complaining about that. Our founding fathers wanted it to work that way. But that is designed to be a laborious process. I'm looking at it a little bit differently. I do have a legislative agenda, and that's what I want to get to by the end of year one. But year one, for me, the focus is actually getting the things done that I don't need either the permission or forgiveness of Congress for. Running the executive branch of the government. That is where the deep state resides. That is where we can actually, the commander-in-chief's powers rest. Why are our U.S. military troops stationed in God knows where, 1.3 million serving today, 700,000 more, plus more than that, in reserve, stationed in places where many of them shouldn't be, all of whom would be proud to actually solve the problem of American deaths on American soil resulting from fentanyl crossing the southern border, for example. So I've said that as commander-in-chief in month one, I will station the U.S. military along our southern border. Building the wall was not enough. There are cartel-financed tunnels, as we talked about, underneath that wall. And so one of the things that I've said is we'd station the U.S. military there. I've said that I would end the Department of Education, for example, or these other departments. That the U.S. president can do on existing legal authority that we talked about earlier. I would end a lot of the executive orders that we have inherited as a burden, as an albatross from prior presidents. I actually pushed Trump's people on this. Why didn't you rescind Executive Order 11246? That was the one that Lyndon Johnson signed that requires any government contractor, that's over 20% of the U.S. workforce working for a government contractor, anybody who does business with the federal government, to adopt race-based quota systems in their hiring. All it takes is a president with a pen, draw a line through that old executive order. That isn't ruling by fiat. That is fixing the rule by fiat that came in the past. Many of these from Biden, from Obama, some from Bill Clinton as well. Take a line, cross it straight through. Jimmy Carter had some awful ones. Lyndon Johnson had the worst ones of all. That's something that I'm focused on early on in the presidency. Replacement for Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. I get that appointment power in January 2026. Have that lined up with plans of reform of the U.S. Federal Reserve. So that's what will give us the momentum boost. So you see, the way I'm thinking about this is the pinprick in the balloon. In Trump's case was he went all in for repeal and replace Obamacare. Congress did not want to come along. I didn't think he had the right bulldogs in there to drive that process through. But then that deflated the momentum behind what else he could get done. The way I'm looking at it is in reverse. We're going to win this election in a landslide. It has to be a landslide. This cannot be, for so many reasons, this cannot be a 50.1 electoral margin. This has to be a Ronald Reagan 1980 style, and I would have done a better job than them. No. I just believe in studying the experiences of others, learning what we can from it so that we can aspire to be better. And that's the way I look at leading as president.
Well, it sounds like you got a great plan. One more thing I want to talk about with breaking this stuff up, and that we hear a lot of talk about term limits.
Yep.
You know, you get the career politicians, you get the geriatrics in there, they don't know what's going on. Everybody says term limits. Here's my fear, and I'm not as spun up on all of this as you are, obviously, so forgive my ignorance.
We have different jobs.
I know you're also an avid 2A
Yes.
guy, correct? And so if we amend this and we make it term limits, doesn't that open it up to amend everything, including 2A, all kinds of other stuff?
It's a great question. So it depends on the method of amendment. So there's two ways to amend the Constitution. One is what's called the legislative method, where Congress or the president can propose it through Congress, that it comes from the federal government, that you get, a supermajority in Congress, then it goes to the states for ratification. That'd be my preferred method. It was Reagan's preferred method. The other method is still, it's constitutional, it exists, and I recognize the authority to do it. And I celebrate the people across the country who have enough civic spirit to try to create one of these as an Article 5 convention, a convention of the states, where it comes bottom up from the states, where they propose that. And in that convention, you're right. You got to be prepared of what comes out. My view is constitutional amendments are slow and cumbersome. So if there's three categories for where I'm driving my change, I just care about effectiveness. Okay, I'm going in there for 8 years. I think about what do I want to do and what do I want to say when I leave office in January 2033. My older son won't even be in high school by then. We're doing this for their generation. I want them to live in the country that is not the same country, a better one than even the one I grew up in, which is the greatest country still known to mankind and human history, if you ask me. Few things I want to say is we have 3 branches of government again, not 4. The administrative state's gone. We're not dependent on our enemy for our modern way of life. That's communist China. Our economy is again growing once again at the fastest pace in the developed world, as it has for most of our history. It can be again. And that we are once again proud, most of us certainly proud to be citizens of this nation. That much I know I can deliver. And in order for me to think about the most effective path to get there,